If you have a Bible, I'd invite you to open with me to the book of Hebrews this morning. That's where we're going to camp out for the next little bit. Hebrews chapter 2, actually. And as you do that, again, this is one of those passages that maybe you don't think about for Christmas season. You usually think of like Luke chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and that sort of a thing. But in the Revised Common Lectionary, which is basically a guide for pastors to figure out, okay, if you need something to preach, this is a great idea, and they recommend this one. And as I was working through this passage this week, it hit me that this is exactly the passage that we need to hear about today. And the reason that we need to hear about this passage today is because I think it answers a question that if we're not asking ourselves, we know lots of people who are asking this question. So as you open today, for the better part of 2,000 years, you need to understand a couple of things. We have observed what's called the liturgical calendar. The liturgical calendar begins in late November or early December with the season of Advent, which we've just done, right? You're all familiar with the 4 Sundays of Advent and that sort of a thing, leading up to Christmas. And most people think of that as the Christmas season, but in reality, it's a season of preparation and anticipation of both the first coming of Jesus and then the second coming of Jesus. And what's really weird, what blows a lot of people's minds, is that we think of, okay, now Christmas is done. We're past the holiday. We're into something new. But on the liturgical calendar, Pastor Amy and I were talking about this morning, the Christmas season actually begins Christmas Eve and runs through the Epiphany, which is the 5th of January or so. And so, as a result, there are these 12 days in between here. This is the official Christmas season. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is exactly where the 12 Days of Christmas song comes from. It's a reference to this moment in the liturgical calendar. And so that means that today, the last couple of days have been the Christmas season. And this is the first Sunday of the Christmas season for us. It also serves as a sort of ending, right, of 1 year and a beginning of the next year. And so I thought it'd be good for us to remind ourselves why Jesus came to earth. And that's what this passage does. So, as I said, Hebrews chapter 2. And if you don't know anything about Hebrews, I just got to acknowledge, that's really not all that surprising. Hebrews is one of those books that, to put it mildly, it's one of the most enigmatic books in the entire Bible, right? It is kind of a mystery. In fact, it's a mystery because we don't know who wrote it. Maybe Pastor Amy does, but officially we don't know who wrote it. The church father Origen in 254 AD said who actually wrote the epistle of the Hebrews, only God knows. And so it's kind of a mystery that surrounds it, right? And we also don't know exactly who he's writing to. I mean, we know that he's writing to Jewish Christians, but we don't know where. We don't know who was the first people to receive this. It's just kind of a vague, generic, all Jewish Christians everywhere. Here you go. And then we're also pretty sure it was written toward the middle of the second half of the 1st century AD, but there is some serious question about that even. So we don't even know officially when it was written. So there's a lot of questions about this book. There is one overarching theme through the entire book of Hebrews, though, and that is that Jesus Christ is superior. We know that. That is point blank and clear throughout this book. From the very beginning to the very end, Jesus Christ is superior. In fact, the author goes through several different things and compares Jesus to them and basically comes up with Jesus is better than all of these. He's better than the angels. He's better than the Jewish priests. He's better than the Old Testament rites and rituals and institutions, including the temple. He's better than basically everything that purports to offer salvation. And this is kind of a big deal about the time the author was writing, because the first people who read this letter to the Hebrews had questions. They were wondering, is Jesus really superior? Is he better than the angels that some people are claiming to hear from? Is he really superior to the wisdom that other teachers are teaching? If he really was the son of a poor carpenter in a land that didn't have a lot of trees, could he really be all that superior to us? Because, he didn't have a whole lot. If he was arrested by the Romans and crucified as an insurrectionist, How is he superior? They deliberately showed how inferior he was. Is Jesus really superior if his followers are constantly persecuted and still struggling with the sin that he supposedly saved them from? To put it all another way, was Jesus really worth following? That's the question they were asking. That's the question I think some people today are asking. And if you don't know somebody, if you're not asking it yourself, I want to submit to you that you do know people today who are asking that very question. Is Jesus worth following? Indeed, I think we all know a friend, a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, somebody who is asking that very question, if not out loud, on the inside. And recent surveys have found that the number of people claiming to be Christians has stopped a multiple year slide because they're beginning to think, well, maybe he is worth following. The number of people reading their Bible has risen dramatically since 2020. So just in the last 5 years, it's gone from about 30% to about 46%. The number of people who have said that they read their Bible in the last month on their own. That is a remarkable increase. And it all points to the fact that people are asking, is Jesus worth following? These new trends are led by Gen Zers, actually, which I find very interesting. If you're not familiar with that term, Gen Zers are Becca and Andrew and younger. They're 20-somethings, and they are coming back to church more than millennials, more than Xers, more than boomers. And I think it's because they've realized that the world's way does not work. And so they're wondering, is Jesus worth following? Now, spoiler alert, I think Jesus is worth following. And I know that's crazy revelation for you guys. Mind-blowing, I get it. And if we're to have any hope that they're going to answer that question the same way, then we need to be able to answer that with a resounding yes of our own. Why would they follow Jesus if the people who say we follow Jesus aren't really sure we want to follow him, right? So, what do you think? Is Jesus worth following? The author of the Hebrews tells us why he most certainly is. So today we want to start. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10 is where we're starting. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. We're going to read down through verse 18. Here's what it says. For in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was entirely appropriate that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. And that is why Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. I will sing hymns to you in the congregation. Again, I will trust in him. And again, here I am with the children God gave me. Verse 14. Now since the children have flesh and blood in common, Jesus also shared in these, so that through his death he might destroy the one holding the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who were held in slavery all their lives by the fear of death. For it is clear that he does not reach out to help angels, but to help Abraham's offspring. Therefore, he had to be like his brothers and sisters in every way so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in matters pertaining to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people. For since he himself has suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are tempted. Now, for the first readers of this letter to the Hebrews, there really was nobody who was just a Christian. You didn't just automatically get to be a Christian because your parents were a Christian, because your grandparents were Christians, because there's a church up the street. That wasn't how that worked, right? It was not a thing, because for most people, following Jesus marked a significant departure from the larger religions of the day. It meant that they were going to have to leave their profession sometimes. It meant they were going to have to leave their family quite often. It meant they were going to be ostracized by a lot of people in the community. It was a big deal to decide, I'm going to follow Jesus. And so we have to recognize that when somebody was asking, is Jesus worth following, they're really asking, is Jesus better than all the other stuff that we could follow instead? So Jews, they worshipped a God who was transcendent, right? Far bigger than anything this entire earth could contain. Is Jesus better than that? Pagans also worshiped gods who, even though they were little idols and they were put on shelves in their temples and things like that, they could rarely be bothered to concern themselves with the matters of mere mortals. And so they were a little bit transcendent because they didn't really get involved with humans all that much. Even the imperial cult, which basically worshipped the Roman emperor, worshipped a great king who was far away in Rome and mighty in power, which was very visible because he's the one that had the armies, that he said go march and take things, and they did exactly what he wanted. So the story of Jesus, in contrast to all of that, began with a baby laid in a manger because there was nowhere other than an animal feeding trough to put him. The son of a poor carpenter from the middle of nowhere Galilee. And when you add in the fact that he was later crucified, a form of execution that was designed specifically to send the message that this person is insignificant, not important, weak. Well, Jesus stood in stark contrast to the sort of God that most people expected or even wanted to follow, right? So it just didn't make a lot of sense. How could this Jesus really be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? What could Jesus possibly offer them? So the author to the Hebrews answered this question in verse 10. And he said very simply, he is bringing many sons and daughters to glory. And it's kind of a weird reference for us, but basically it means that he's trying to bring us into God's presence. Now, out of the gate, that's a little bit compelling because, how many people make it their ultimate life goal to be rich, famous, and glorious, right? We want to have the powerful thing. We want to have the attention. We want to have the spotlight on us. But even if we don't want these things, we want to be in control. And so if we can share a little bit of that glory, glory is extremely compelling. But notice again how Jesus is accomplishing this purpose. In verse 10, the author says, he is the pioneer of our salvation. The word translated pioneer could also be translated author, leader, or champion. As in, he is the one who drafted the plan for our salvation. He is the one who shows us what it looks like to be saved. And he is the one who makes it possible for us to be saved. As in, our salvation is not something that we do ourselves. It's kind of hard to claim the glory for that, isn't it? And then he says that that's Jesus, was made perfect through sufferings. As in, it is in part because of the things he endured on earth that he is the perfect candidate to save. And as we see in verse 11, to sanctify us. Now that word sanctify is critical. It means to set us apart exclusively to the service of God. Right? And in order for that to work, our sin has to be removed. The things that are not quite right about us has to be gone. And we have to begin to do what God wants us to do. All of which suggests that this isn't really about our glory at all. But that Jesus is setting out to bring God's glory and bring us into God's glory. And indeed, I think that's the first thing we have to get. Jesus is bringing us to God's glory. But there are two key components of this. Number one, Jesus is working in and through us so that we can bring glory to God. We'll come back to that in just a second. But number two, he's working in and through us so that someday we will be able to enter into God's glory and spend eternity in his presence. We love that one, don't we? It's the first one that maybe we have a little bit of a challenge with, but we'll get there. It's okay. But Jesus is bringing us to God's glory. So everything about Christmas, everything about this story of the Gospels, including his execution, his weakness, all of that stuff, it was to serve that purpose, to bring us to God's glory. Now, of course, I get it. We're 2,000 years removed from the fact, and we look around ourselves and we have to ask ourselves, okay, how could Jesus bring us to God's glory if he really is just a poor carpenter's son? It's the same question that the first readers of this letter were asking, right? They were wondering, he's just a poor carpenter's son, he was crucified, can he really deliver on these promises? Now, fortunately for us, the author to the Hebrews goes on and he explains in verse 10, it was entirely appropriate. I love it when people say, it makes sense if you think about it this way. That's basically what the author is saying. If Jesus is going to bring us to glory, then it all makes sense, because the key implication of that statement, that Jesus is going to bring us to glory, is that, well, think of it this way. If I were to ask you to bring in the mail, what would be the first thing you have to do? You have to go to the mailbox outside and bring it in, don't you? We understand that. So also, the first step in bringing us to glory is that Jesus had to step out of glory because we were there, outside of the glory. So he had to come to earth. He had to enter into our mess so that he could help us get out of it and get into the glory. So that's the second thing I'll give you today. Jesus entered our mess. That's really what the incarnation is, right? Jesus entered the earth. He put on human form and he became one of us. And along with that, he got all the fun things that go along with being human, right? He got hungry. He got tired. This is maybe a little bit revolutionary for you, but I think Jesus got cranky once in a while. Maybe that explains the whole table flipping thing. I don't know. I imagine that every now and then he was messy. Can you imagine changing the diapers on the Son of God? Think about that for a second. Could you imagine being the Son of God who said, okay, I guess I'll put on diapers? That's what Jesus did. Jesus entered our mess because he needed to in order to bring us. And verses 11 through 13 explain how this works. It says, both Jesus and us have the same Father, right? As in, Jesus wasn't born of God. That's not how that worked. Jesus was always the begotten Son of God. And we're a little lower than he is on the spectrum of things because of that. But he looks at us and he sees us as his beloved creation, his children, people that he created, and he wants us to be with him. And so he came to proclaim the Father's name to his brothers and sisters, to us, right? He put on human form so that he could say, hey, this is the way to God. This is who God is. This is where he is. This is how you get there. But if he's going to do more than just preach at us, because how many of us like to be preached at? Anybody like to be preached at? A couple of you are like, maybe. Sermons. You like sermons? Okay, that's good. I like sermons too. That's why I do this, I guess, right? But I don't think many of us enjoy being beat over the head with a stick. Hey, this is what you're doing wrong, right? So if he was going to do more than just preach at us, Jesus was going to have to share the same sort of experiences that we share, right? So he put himself in a situation where he would have to trust in God the Father. That's what he says, right? He says, here's the Father, and then the next thing he says is, I will trust in you. And I think that's important because Jesus putting himself in a spot where he has to trust the Father, basically that's the same spot we're in, right? How many of us have to trust God to provide for our needs? Of course. How many of us have to trust God to provide us with the strength to get through the day? Yeah. Of course. How many of us have to trust God for the comfort we need to get through the tough times? How many of us have to decide every now and then to trust God to define right and wrong because we think we know what's right and wrong and we want this, but God says, this might be better. Every one of us is in that boat, right? And Jesus had to do all of those things while he was here on earth. So now he doesn't just shake his head when he sees our sin and our inadequacy. Rather, he proudly pronounces, here I am with the children God gave me. These are my brothers, my sisters. I'm hanging out with them. We've been through it together. We've seen some things. Put another way, because Jesus' purpose is to bring us to God's glory, he put on flesh and blood and walked in our shoes. He entered our mess for a bit so he could represent us to the Father. and say, I get it. I know what they're going through. Show us what it really looks like to trust in God. And also represent the Father to us. Say, hey, I've been through it. I know what it is to do God's will, even in this time. But you know what's maybe the coolest part of the incarnation? This Christmas story? It's the fact that because Jesus put on flesh and blood and came into our mess, He can now relate with us. He knows what we're going through. He gets it. Because He gets it, He becomes the best representative we could possibly have in front of God. Jesus entered our mess. But you know there's a danger with that. I mean, that's good stuff, and I enjoy talking about that, but there is a danger that is related to that, and that is, it is easy to convince ourselves that Jesus entered our mess just so He could hang out with us in the middle of it, right? Anybody like sitting in a mud bath? Pigs do, don't they? And it's easy for us to say, well, Jesus entered into the mud bath so He could hang out with us, and it's a therapeutic thing for Him, right? But that's not what this is about. See, since the dawn of Christianity, there have been people who think that's all Jesus wants of us. He just wants to hang out with us in the middle of the muck and the mire. But remember, His objective is to bring us to God's glory. And if we're going to bring God glory in this life, and if we're going to enter His glory in the next life, then somehow, some way, we need to get out of the mess that we're in. You follow me? Now, of course, that presents a bit of a problem. Because, okay, how many of you know today you've been in that mess? Of course, we've all been in that mess, right? And how many of you know today how hard it is to get out of the mess? Truth is, mud is sticky, isn't it? In fact, just this week, it's maybe a better illustration to use the illustration of a frozen pond or a river. Just the other day, we were driving over the Mississippi River, and on the Wisconsin side of the Mississippi River at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, we were talking about how the temperature's in the mid-40s and the ice is getting thinner, and there are warnings out saying you don't want to walk on the ice because you never know when it might break under you and that sort of a thing. And here we drive by this parking lot where there's a whole bunch of people that were fishing on the water, on the ice, just down below from the bridge. And I was saying to the kids, not a great time to be walking on the ice because it's a little bit dangerous. It's been so warm and that sort of a thing. But the good news is right where they were, it was only about 3 feet deep. So, you know, they fall through it, they can climb their way back out. But this last week it didn't work that way for a kid here in Iowa. Maybe you saw the story. Fell through the ice and wasn't able to get out. Truth is, when you fall through the ice into the water, you can try to get out, but the ice begins to collapse under you. And it just breaks away, and it's almost impossible to pull yourself out without help. That's what Jesus does for us. He brings us the help. Remember how the first readers of this letter were wondering, is Jesus really worth following because He's just the carpenter's son who was crucified? Well, starting in verse 14, the author unveils some pretty amazing news, and that is that Jesus helps us to overcome. He helps us to escape. He came into the mess so that we could be pulled out. And here's how it works. Verse 14, He put on flesh and blood so that we could have that in common with Him. He could have that in common with us. But also so He could die. Think about that for just a second. If He hadn't put on flesh and blood and become a human, He could not die. That's important, because He died so that He might destroy the one holding the power of death, the author to the Hebrews says. And according to the Bible, death is the result of the first sin, right? It wasn't a part of creation until people broke the rules. People did what they weren't supposed to do. But because Jesus never sinned, His death satisfied God's wrath for everybody who will trust and follow Him. The penalty for sin is paid. We will still die physically, that's true. But for those who follow Jesus, physical death just ushers us into God's glory. Right? And that's going to be awesome. So we don't have to be afraid anymore. What's more, in verse 16, we learn that Jesus reaches out to help Abraham's offspring. He doesn't help the angels. They don't need his help. But we do. And the chances are you and I are not Abraham's offspring. I get that. But if we follow Jesus, the Bible tells us that we are his spiritual descendants. And when does he help us? When does Jesus offer to help us? Well, verse 18, since he has himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help us when we are tempted. As in, Jesus can help us overcome temptation and live a life that is both holy in the sense that we don't have to sin anymore and victorious. As in, we don't have to succumb to the garbage the rest of this world throws at us. Jesus helps us overcome. He helps us overcome, but before we finish, I just have to be clear about three things, actually. Number one, to say that Jesus helps us overcome is not to say that it's impossible for a follower of Jesus to sin. Truth is, we can still choose to do things that we know are not quite right. It'd be really nice if we didn't have that, if he just overwrote that and it was gone, but that's not the way it works. And if we keep doing things we know that are not quite right, if we keep choosing those things, eventually we will lose that salvation. Second thing, we need to understand that just because Jesus helps us overcome doesn't mean that overcoming sin is going to be instantaneous. It's going to be a lifelong process. It doesn't just snap his fingers and it happens. Similarly, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Truth is, overcoming sin is an extremely difficult thing to do. But rather, it's to say that Jesus makes all of this possible. With his help, we can live a life that is holy, without sin. It's gone. We can be driven by love and love alone, and we can be dedicated to serving the Lord every day of our lives because Jesus helps us overcome. I don't know where you are this final Sunday of 2025. But if you're thinking you need a new start, if you're thinking I need to figure out how to overcome these things in my life that are not quite right, I want to suggest to you that we can start this new year a little bit early by choosing to follow Jesus and claiming these promises that he has given us. My friends, Jesus came to get us out of our mess and lead us to glory, God's glory, which is way better than our glory. And in order to do that, he made it possible for us to overcome the temptation and sin that we so often allow to dominate our lives. We don't have to do those things anymore because Jesus helps us overcome. Would you pray with me today? Father, we thank you for the good news that you sent Jesus so he could lead us to your glory. And we thank you today that he did put on human flesh and blood. He became one of us so that he could represent you to us, but also us to you. So that he would understand what it is to be tempted and to suffer and all of those things, so that he could help us when we face those things. Today, Lord, we ask that you would remind us of these promises daily, especially as we enter into this new year. That you, Lord, would make it so that we are made new from the inside out, so that we also can overcome, so that we can live lives above temptation, without sin, and we can serve you and bring you glory every single day until we see your face. And when we see your face, it'll be the greatest celebration of our lives. We claim these promises today, O Lord. Amen.